I am massively late to the party when it comes to Strangers of Paradise, but I've had a lot of free time on my hands because of some family stuff, so I got a chance to really sit down and give it a good go. I haven't completed this game. I'm about, I would say, 2/3 of the way through. I took my time. I did a lot of the side missions. I explored a lot of the jobs because I just wanted to get a feel of things. And as a preamble, when I first saw this, I was very, very excited. I thought it looked really good. The fact that there was like an ARPG Final Fantasy style game. There was a lot of hack and slash action, and I'm a big fan of the Neo series as well, so I thought, well, this could actually be quite a good combination. So having played it, these are my final thoughts on the game. So graphically, this is not a next-gen game, but it does still look very impressive. It is built on a modified version of the Neo engine from what I can tell. And as you can imagine, back in the day, that did look very, very impressive. And they have kind of like tweaked things to make it look all shiny. And there's loads of big flashy spells all over the place. But it certainly doesn't feel like it belongs in the next generation category of games. So I don't know really where to start. Let's talk about the world itself. This is not an open world game by any stretch of imagination. In fact, I would go as far to say that the world building on this is super, super lazy. You have a big map where you just select the next mission that you want to go to. The side missions are literally you going into the world, but you do it backwards with limited stuff cut off. And it's basically you run down a tunnel, hacking and slashing everything until you get to a boss, and then you fight the boss and move on. In terms of story as well, this is probably the worst bit for me. This is also the reason why I'm actually probably not going to complete this game. It's so convoluted and it throws you into a universe where you just don't know what's going on. And it's so abstract, and the way that they throw the term chaos around it just feels very, very memey. There's plenty of tongue-in-cheek quips and funny, cheesy lines, which are good fun, but I don't feel like I've got any relation to the characters whatsoever. I don't feel the urge to go off and, find out what's happened to them. There's also no side plot character building. You don't get to know anything really about each of the characters as an individual. And because of the nature of the job system, so your side characters do have a specific role associated with them, but it doesn't feel like they own those specific roles. There's no ultimate weapons as far as I know, which was something that I always liked about the previous series, that you could, get, a special weapon that relates to that special character. It is very much just like pump as much EXP into the character and, equip the associated clothing with the organize button and just keep going till you complete the game. I'd also just like to say, getting all the negative stuff out of the way, when you first play the game, you feel like, oh yeah, they've brought in that kind of iconic character and that creature, and it's like, oh, that's really good. This is going to be very, very Final Fantasy. And then you realise that they've only put in like a handful of enemies, and doesn't matter what world you're in, you find yourself just fighting the same enemies mixed together in a random mishmash over and over again. And that became really apparent later on. Occasionally they would throw in a new enemy, but like you'll be fighting in some zones and it's just like, well, why is this creature here? Why would there be a horse in this high-tech facility? And it just didn't marry up at all. So the reason why this game is good is the whole job system, or at least the action combat. It's a lot of fun. There's a unique take on how to use magic and mana. And it did feel a little bit like Devil May Cry, and there's a very satisfying block system that you can then use to do big counters and big flashy abilities. There's also a lot of jobs. It is a little bit misleading in the fact that it's like, oh, you've got all these different jobs and, you can have all these different unique abilities. But the real truth of it is that you have basically a handful of primitive jobs, and then all of those jobs that spawn off of those basically are an extension of those original base jobs. And these basically can go into, you've got magic classes, you've got single-handed weapon classes, the rogue classes, and then you've got your warrior-esque berserker style classes. Each of the classes have their own unique skill, which does, yes, make them unique in their own way. So for example, you have like the warrior class that does a shout and has a regen, and then you've got the samurai class later on that basically does another sort of shouty thing that restores mana regeneration. You've got the berserker class that can add attack damage and attack speed. But in terms of the actual abilities they use, they all stem from their base classes and whatever that class brings. So when you finally get to an advanced class, it's basically a mishmash of all the other classes that you've got with that iconic, unique ability. And it was really fun leveling them. I really did enjoy the magic classes as well. I loved their interpretation of how to use magic, and the fact that you could do melee and big magic-y combos. But in terms of the melee classes, after a while, it just did feel very, very samey, and I was going from one class to another, and I was just like, well, what is the real difference here? And I ended up just going down the magic route, which I did find really, really fun. I didn't find any bugs within the game. There were some things that I felt could have been explained a little bit better. The tutorial level was really slapdash and lazy in my eyes. They could have, progressed you into the game and explained things as you went through and did them. But instead, it was just like one world where you've got tons and tons of side missions, and it explained what each of one of them did. There's also a crafting system, if you can call it a crafting system, with the smithy. That wasn't explained. I didn't even realise that it was there until about a quarter of the way through. And where they've got loads of narration on the actual voice acting and stuff, which is really good, they didn't do any voice narration as they on the tutorials as well. But yeah, the crafting system is basically you crunch up all of the items that you find, turn it into materials, and then you can increase some stats on some weapons here and there. And honestly, it didn't really feel like it made any difference whatsoever, and you get so much loot all the time. It's just like, why would I bother to do this? It felt like, I could just may as well go all the way to the end and then level up, the big weapon that I get then. And by that time, you've probably completed the game, so it's just like, why? And it's also just purely for like upgrading stats on weapons, not upgrading or creating new weapons either. I think there would have been certainly a lot of appeal if you could go off, find rare materials, and again craft that ultimate weapon that I mentioned before. I also think it's worth mentioning, by the time you get halfway through the game, you've pretty much explored all it has in terms of its combat features. You won't have unlocked all the classes, but you certainly would have got to the classes that you're tailoring down and want to get to. So at that point, it's like you're not doing things out of necessity, you're just doing it because you're curious about another class. So, in terms of where I am now, I feel like I've consumed so much of the game, it feels a little bit samey at this point. So I probably will come back and explore it further and finally complete it. But every time I go into a level, it's the same loop, and it just feels like I'm doing the same thing over and over again. It's not giving me enough different stuff to justify me to carry on play it, really, and the story is pretty tripe. I think with friends this game is a lot better because it does have a Phantasy Star feel to it, and I absolutely loved it, and I loved just running through short dungeons with my friends and had a great time. But because the item system is absolutely garbage and really boring and just kind of stat inflation all the way through, it just doesn't incentivize me to get items other than just to kill the harder enemies because I can't do it without their stats. There's no chasing kind of like that big mystical blade that I want, that I associate with Final Fantasy series. But there we have it. That's my experience with the game so far. I don't hate it. But I'm not going to write home to mum about it anytime soon. I'm also a firm believer that price often does impact my review score. If this was a cheaper title, I probably would have gone, this is actually really good for the price it is, and thank you very much. But the fact is that I paid £60 for this title, and that's a lot of money. And considering Elden Ring was only 50 and gave me 1 billion times more, I'm kind of left wondering, well, what am I going to get for my extra money that I've paid here? Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I've got loads to talk about, so we'll be back with more news and reviews soon.